2024. Smart Business.
Ni Alhamisi, na basi Alhamisi itakapofika jua ni wakati wa kipindi kipendacho cha Karibu East Africa, kipindi ambacho kinakujuza kwa kina yanayotendeka katika kanda hii ya Afrika Mashariki, haswa katika ulimwengu wa kibiashara. Mimi ni Sadam Muballe na haya ndiyo tuliyokuandalia katika awamu hii ya Karibu East Africa. Now, the aim to attain a single currency for East Africa by 2024 has been postponed. The region bloc has concluded that the progress has been slower than anticipated. The East African Community Council of Ministers, the central decision-making and the governing organ of the East African Community, has resolved that the 2024 deadline by which the region is supposed to have formed a monetary union and adopted a common currency is not attainable.
Basically, when they signed the East African monetary union protocol sometime in 2013, the East African member countries gave themselves 10 years as a roadmap. We are going to move for 10 years, and within this period of 10 years there are certain benchmarks and milestones against which we want to be able to measure our ability and our readiness in order to enter into a common monetary currency. But for some reason, some of those macroeconomic, they call them convergence criteria, we have not been able to meet them. We are getting late, and it is not feasible. I think they are now realizing that we have been slow at achieving these convergence indicators, and we might not be in a position to do that.
The Council has therefore resolved to draw a new timeline to achieve the ambitious target of creating the East African Monetary Union, which is one of the four pillars of the region integration. The East African Community is way behind in setting up a relevant institution to support a single currency, most importantly being the East African Monetary Institute, the relevance of the region's central bank that was supposed to be up and running in the year 2015.
There are some other key institutions that were supposed to be in place, and many of them have not yet been established. For example, when they went to Germany to benchmark the central bank governance, they tried to look at the concept of the East African Monetary Institute. This institute was established in the Eurozone before they came to the common currency, and what they wanted is that particular institute does the preparatory work towards this particular common currency. This was supposed to have done by 2015, but up to now it is not there. So those key institutions, including the East African Bureau of Statistics, which is supposed to collect and gather data, which is basically credible data, because when we go into this union without a Bureau of Statistics, people will report anything. And when they report what is not correct, you might find yourself into trouble. There is also the East African Surveillance, Compliance and Enforcement Commission. It is also not yet in place. So there are quite a number of things that are obstructing the meeting of the current deadline.
Member countries were also supposed to comply with the East African Community macroeconomic convergence targets on inflation, public debt, forex reserves, the budget deficit, with which every little progress has been made in harmonizing key economic policies, casting doubts on the region's commitment to the monetary union dream.
When Uganda goes into a monetary union, we will be responsible for Kenya's debt, Kenya will be responsible for our debt. So those are all issues. That's why you see it's good at talking. But implementing a monetary union means a lot of harmonization along the what? The countries, the community. So we want a monetary union, but we fear a monetary union, although we are working towards a monetary union, because it has its own issues that are really very difficult.
Okay. So that these convergence indicators are four largely. Some of them are fiscal in nature, and they include the inflation, which has got to be contained within a ceiling of 8%. And then they have also talked about foreign reserves, which should be able to take a country as measured in terms of imports capacity to 4.5 months. And the other criteria is, of course, debt. This public debt. It has got to be contained within the 50% threshold. And I think we also talk about the fiscal deficit. This is the real issue of budget deficit, which, by the way, creates that problem of debt financing. This is supposed to be within a range of 3 to 3.5%.
The first two pillars of the East African integration have registered a success after creating a customs union, and a common market have already been achieved, while the ultimate target of setting up a political federation was supposed to come after the creation of a monetary union, which makes the attainability of the remaining two pillars doubtful.
Every government needs this central bank to leverage the monetary policy for its own whatever. The moment you give up the monetary policy, you have given out your pass or your bank account to another person. That's why you saw the problems among the Greeks. They could not print money to overcome some of the financial hardships they had, and that's why the British refused to join the Eurozone, even when they were the European Union, because of monetary policy. So the problem with the monetary policy is that you will have to lose that ability to run that action.
Member countries were also supposed to comply with the East African Community macroeconomic convergence targets on inflation, public debt, forex reserves, the budget deficit, with which every little progress has been made in harmonizing key economic policies, casting doubts on the region's commitment to the monetary union dream.
When you measure now in around 2019, what we have is something that shows countries have struggled to manage the inflation, control of inflation within about 8%. They have struggled to do that. And also the foreign reserve base for our countries in the region. I think many of them are managing the 4.5 months reserve, ability to import for 4.5 months. But when it comes to that issue of debt, thresholds, we are still ahead. It is not possible for Kenya to come down before 2021. And remember that the requirement in the protocol is that we are ready 3 years before. So if we are not there by 2021, then the only thing you have to do is to make adjustments in the debts.
The East African Community single currency is expected to create more economic unity among member countries and help eliminate transaction costs related to exchanging currencies and exchange rate volatiles.
Like on single currency for one reason, that you are able to transact among yourselves without needing the dollar. And that has been one of the problems in Africa. You need a dollar to be able to buy from your neighbor. But if we have a single currency, we'll have overcome this.
The protocol for the establishment of the East African Community Monetary Union was signed on 30th of November 2013 by the heads of states in Kampala for 10 years roadmap for member states to embrace a single currency regime. The East African Community Council of Ministers has agreed to review the roadmap for the implementation of the single currency, with the technical committee expected to draw a new timeline basing on the assessment of the hindrances in the initial set for milestones. Under the Monetary Union Protocol, partner states agreed on the creation of 4 key institutions, under which the member states are to attain and maintain a set of 4 primary convergence criteria for at least 3 years before joining the bloc's planned single currency strategy. The institution comprises the East African Monetary Institute, the East African Financial Service Commission, the East African Statistics Bureau, and the East African Surveillance Compliance and Enforcement Commission. According to the Monetary Union Protocol, the East African Monetary Institute was to have been functional by the year 2015, while the other institutions were supposed to be operational by last year. The East African Monetary Institution, expected to be the transitory institution to do all the preparatory work for the activation of a single currency regime before eventual transformation into the East African Central Bank. Member countries are required to meet and comply with a debt to gross domestic product, a ratio of 50%, fiscal deficit of 3%, and the GDP overall inflation of 8%, and a forex reservation of 4.3 months of import cover for at least 3 years before the launch of the single currency regime. Member countries have reported a mixed performance on this front, with the deadline for compliance 2021 less than 2 years away. It should be noted that it is not the first time that integrations have failed to establish and implement a single currency, with the most recent being the West Africa's ECO, which has experienced several postpones, with the latest being the 2020 target. The East African native banks have been ranked among the world's top best lenders by The Banker, which is a London-based international financial affairs publication. The banks include the KCB, the Opportunity Bank, and the Diamond Trust Bank. Shamira Nagawa with the report.
East Africa's top banks ranked among the world's 1,000 best lenders. They weathered a tough operating environment in 2019 to post stronger growth, while cautioning themselves against further shocks. The monthly London-based international financial affairs publication called The Banker, owned by the Financial Times Limited, shows that KCB, Equity, Diamond Trust Bank and Cooperative Bank, which are largely retail banks, remain resilient in a tough operating environment to maintain an upward growth in profitability. They made significant strides in strengthening their balance sheets and increasing their Tier 1 capital in line with the Basel III requirements. Tier 1 capital is largely primary funding source for banks, reserved to ensure banking operations are not disrupted or shut down during periods when lenders make losses. According to the magazine, global banks' total profit increased by a paltry 2% to $1.13 trillion in 2019 from $1.11 trillion in 2018. This is largely due to tighter regulations, high capital requirements, competition from financial technology firms, and low interest rates in Europe and the US, which made earnings and banking profits so difficult to sustain. According to the report notes, the shrinking banking assets in Europe and Central Asia, lackluster profits everywhere, and an uncertain economic environment paints a grim picture of the global banking industry's earning prospects. The rankings saw Chinese banks dominate the top 4 positions, measure the world's best performing banks based on key parameters such as profitability, Tier 1 capital, assets, return on assets, non-performing loans ratio, total loans to assets ratio, and profit on capital ratio. KCB, which is in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, improved its position to 717 from 809 last year after posting a 17.87% growth in profitability to $332 million and increasing its Tier 1 capital by 30.71% to $1.07 billion. Its balance sheet grew 11.96% to $7.013 billion, while the capital assets ratio increased to 15.39%, up from 13.18%. The bank's return on assets stands at 3.36%, non-performing loans ratio 6.07%, and the loans to assets ratio 65.83%. Equity, with over 14 million customers across the region, has operations in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and a commercial office in Ethiopia. The bank's position on the Global 1000 ranking fell to 844 from last year's 799, partly due to a decline in the level of Tier 1 capital by 8.95% to $772 million. However, the lender managed to grow its profit by 7.32% to $279 million and increased its level of assets by 10.81% to $5.63 billion. Its return on assets stood at 3.46%, non-performing loans ratio 7.85%, loans to assets ratio 53.31%, while its capital assets ratio declined to 13.72% from 16.7%. Cooperative Bank, which has a regional subsidiary in South Sudan, climbed one position to 950 from 951 last year, with its Tier 1 capital increasing by 3.73% to $571 million, and total assets increasing by 8.31% to $4.05 billion. The bank made a 12.23% growth in profit to $178 million, but saw a slight decline in capital asset ratio to 14.08% from 14.7%. Its non-performing loans ratio stood at 10.3% and loans to assets ratio 66.47%. Diamond Trust Bank, which has a foothold in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda and Burundi, came in at a position 981 after increasing its Tier 1 capital by 13% to $527 million and growing its balance sheet by 5.38% to $3.7 billion. Its earnings increased 10.41% to $108 million, while the capital asset ratio increased to 14.21% from 13.25%.
Now, South Sudan has rushed to pay its 3 million poultry out of the 27 million in order to avoid being suspended from the East African Community for non-payment of its membership fee. Now, the pressure was mounted on the Republic of South Sudan by the East African Legislative Assembly, who called for the suspension of the world's youngest nation.
The Kenyan representative to East African Legislative Assembly, Wanjichi Muhia, told the Assembly that the Council of Ministers should suspend the Republic of South Sudan. In response, the Council of Ministers demanded for an investigation to determine whether South Sudan should be suspended or not, as in the offing. The East African Community Secretariat has been directed to develop a procedure of investigations for breaches of the treaty along the schedules of sanctions, as stated by Kenya's Minister for East African Affairs, Adan Mohammed. South Sudanese legislators Kennedy Mukulia and Kim Gai pleaded for more time.
There have been efforts to make sure that we do. And of late, the same 2019, we were able to pay $3 million. So at least by now we have paid $4 million.
On a personal note, I support that, because we don't want to milk a cow that we are not feeding. This will never solve anything. It's so embarrassing that my own country is not paying for the community that they decided to apply to join.
The treaty is very clear. Let us not, crack our brains with suggestions. If it means that a member state has to be suspended, or if a member state decides that they're going to withdraw, then be it. Instead of us being put under this pressure, it is unnecessary, and I don't think it serves any purpose.
Dr. William Tayewa, a senior lecturer at Makerere University, reacted to the decision of the East African Legislative Assembly expelling South Sudan from the bloc.
But we also know that South Sudan has had challenges of paying. So the rationale was to expand, first of all, the market, the free economic zone, for instance, the cooperation in terms of politics, based on the fact that already the existing countries have a lot in common in terms of the movement of their peoples. A very good example is that Uganda, as we speak in 2019, hosts the biggest number of South Sudanese refugees. We also have very many Ugandans, actually, who are doing various types of business in South Sudan. So there is mutual benefit between those two countries, and for the region as well, because South Sudan, there are many South Sudanese in Kenya, there are many South Sudanese all over the country. So there is obvious benefit in having South Sudan within the community, as was the rationale when they accepted the country. These other countries, the rest of the other countries, have been paying their dues to the community. Maybe they have fallen behind in terms of deadline for payment, but they have shown commitment to pay their dues, which seems not to have been the case with South Sudan. It's not very clear. So the economy of South Sudan is really not doing very well at all because of inability to sell oil, which is the major export earner for the country. So that is having a very major effect. I think very many donors as well have cut aid to the country because of the war, of the civil war and the political impasse that has taken place in that country. So I believe that the country has the will and they see the benefit of being part of the East African community, but the way things are right now, they have no capacity to pay that huge amount of money without completely running down the economy.
He urges East African Legislative Assembly to give South Sudan more time because of the challenges faced by this youngest economy, like civil wars, political instability, among others.
We know that South Sudan has been going through a lot. The civil war that started in 2013 has, in December of 2013, has really, destabilized the country in very, very many ways. There have been also, various skirmishes since, but the country is on the way to being stable. So I believe that there can be an extension by the East African Legislative Assembly, so that South Sudan puts their act in order and they join the East African community when they are ready. So there can be a moratorium, but not to completely remove them from the East African community arrangement.
The resolution to suspend South Sudan also forced other countries to clear their outstanding balances. Kenya paid $4.8 million, Tanzania $2 million, and Burundi $1.2 million. It's only Uganda that had paid beyond its contribution of $8 million and had a surplus of about $2 million. According to the East African Community Treaty, all partner states are supposed to remit all their annual contribution by December of every financial year. But none has ever met this requirement, which normally sends the community into a financial crisis. The East African community is largely dependent on donor handouts to a tune of more than 51% of the community's annual budget, which makes it vulnerable to external influence. The East African community has proposed an alternative financing mechanism to deal with the problem. The proposal, if adopted by partner states, will see members agree on the tax percentage on the imports to finance the community. Some countries have opposed the proposal because Kenya, being the largest economy in the region, will have more powers when it comes to the decisions in the community.
Basi kufikia hapo, hayo ndio tuliokuandalia. Mimi ni Sadam Muballe. Tuonane juma lijalo Alhamisi.
Smart 24.